The talk is on the life and work of William Robertson, Kilkenny's first architect. It's fitting that we should be here in what's regarded as one of his greatest works, which he started 200 years ago and went on for 10 years, the remodelling of this lovely castle. So before I get into his life, some misconceptions about him. He was in London between 1797 and 1799, and which gave rise to him being called a young London architect with an eye on Kilkenny. It's also been said that he was a Londoner of Scots ancestry, an English-born architect, active in and around Kilkenny, and a Kilkenny-based English architect. But we know that he was born here in Kilkenny, and apart from that short time in London, spent his entire life in the city. He has been confused with another architect, Daniel Robertson, an American-born, British-based architect who worked in Ireland around the same time as him, 1830s and 1840s, designing buildings such as Wilton Castle and Johnstone Castle in Wexford. But he's best known for his design of the terraces at Powerscourt Gardens. When working there, it's said that he was wheeled around. His gout was so bad he was wheeled around in a wheelbarrow, fortified by a bottle of sherry. And when the sherry finished, work ceased for the day. So it's even been said that the two were thought to be brothers, but they were not related. It's really remarkable that there should be two architects named Robertson of roughly the same age with similar styles, both working in Southeast Ireland in the 1830s and 40s. But this was indeed the case. I don't know if they ever met or collaborated or what, but I'm sure they were aware of each other. Now, William Robertson was baptised in St. Mary's Church on 4th of December 1770. Down here, all it says about him is William, son of Robinson, not Robertson, 4th of December. So we can deduce from that he was born in late November or very early December. His family background, his father came from Scotland and settled in the city in about 1765, and he opened a garden nursery shop on High Street. He married Marjorie Jones from Clonmel in 1766. They had 2 sons and 4 daughters. John Robertson, William's elder brother, took over the family garden nursery business. He became a respected scientific botanist and a practical horticulturist, on which subjects he published extensively. He never married and is buried in St. Mary's Churchyard. Susanna, the elder of the girls, married John McGrath in 1814. They had no issue. He went into partnership with John Robertson in the nursery business, leaving John to continue with his scientific pursuits. And he served as a magistrate, mayor and high sheriff of Kilkenny. Elizabeth married Timothy Nolan in 1813, and they had 2 sons. He had an interest in a hatting establishment on the High Street and in the Merino factory down at Anamalt. They emigrated to Australia in 1822 following the financial collapse of the Willen enterprise. They more or less absconded because they'd been given about 30,000 as a grant from the Irish government, and it wasn't recovered. And I think they did a bit of chasing up, but he was never brought to book. His son became very famous in Australia in politics. The 2 younger girls, Mary and Marjorie, both died in infancy. This is where this fine 5-bay, 3-story house on the High Street is where William was born. They occupied, that's where the nursery, that's where the garden seed shop was. And over here, from about 1813, is where the Kilkenny Moderator offices were and where it was published. We know nothing of William Robertson's early education. He didn't go to Kilkenny College. which was a boarding school, so being locally went elsewhere. There was a charter school in Kilkenny in addition to Catholic schools, and there were also 3 private schools. He may, for example, have attended Mr. Talbot's school on the High Street near his home, or that of Mr. Jones on the Canal Walk. I think it was the latter. These 2 private schools opened in the 1780s. After schooling in Kilkenny, he attended the Dublin Society Drawing Schools, enrolling in 1793, and he went into the figure drawing class in 1794. He won a silver medal for drawing in 1795. His name appears on the registers as William Robertson, just as in his baptismal record, rather than Robertson. So after leaving the Dublin Society schools, he went to England, where he possibly worked for a time in the offices of a London architect. He exhibited 3 drawings at the Royal Academy of Arts in 1797 and 1798 while in London, where he stayed at George Street on the Surrey Road. He exhibited the college, Kilkenny College, a drawing of that and of this castle, and also a design for a garden front of a villa. So he kept a journal from 1795, and in it he has some sketches and his itinerary while he was in England, visiting stately homes and so on. But he was working hard there, and he produced 2 books while he was there. He was only 27 at the time. The first, a collection of various forms of stoves they're kind of heated houses for forcing pine plants, fruit trees, and preserving tender exotic plants. The original selling price was 2 guineas, and in 2009, a first edition sold for 3,500. The second, a much more elaborate book, is designs in architecture covering everything. As you can see there, garden chairs, mausoleums, bridges, aviaries, temples, everything. And that was also published in French in the same year. These are some of the images from the first publication. And he calls this a small greenhouse here with 2 conservatories. And he's, as we'll see later in his buildings, he uses a pediment which is glazed here in the middle. And he's planned for a plain kitchen garden, greenhouse, blah, blah, blah. And it includes gardener's apartments. So that's the design you'll use if you want a plain kitchen garden. But of course, we have to remember that his audience are the big landowners in England and Ireland. So he's couching this for them, really. And this is the second book. Here we see a drawing. It's by George Holmes, who I'll mention again later, who was in London at the same time as Robertson and worked here as well. It's of a sage and his pupil, and instructing him on architectural designs. It's dedicated to Frederick Trench of Haywood in Laois, and Trench was a respected amateur architect and a friend of James Gandon. He may have sponsored Robertson's work in London or provided him with introductions to nobility in England. See, Robertson grew up surrounded by gardening paraphernalia, as his father and brother were nurserymen who sold plants, shrubs and trees, including stove and greenhouse plants. Later, in a promotional advert for a book of his to be published, he's referred to as William Robertson, architect and picturesque planter. He would go on to design the extensive grounds to the house Orchardton on the Callan Road. I see David Fitzgerald, that's his home, or was his home. And Robertson later built that with 2 walled gardens with a greenhouse and finery on 30 acres laid out with walks and ornamentally planted, much as in his book. That's another plate from it. A temple of Neptune there's Neptune, his characteristic pediment there. So you'd want to have a very big garden to include that. So when he returned to Kilkenny, he set himself up as an architect in the home place on 29 High Street, and afterwards at number 12 William Street, which he built in about 1810. One of his first country house commissions was to rebuild Castlecomer House, ancestral home of Lady Anne Ormond, which had been destroyed during the rebellion of 1798. He completed this in 1802 in a grand manner, but it's now demolished with no trace remaining of the main building. Some of his early work on large country houses included Woodstock, where he added 2 wings to the mansion as well as garden follies in the grounds, including the lovely Swiss cottage. His early work also included the new county jail, a good spacious stone building with 48 cells for the prisoners on Stephen Street, although Nicky Marr doubts that. He says it's more Francis Terrace, but I think the whole lot, entrance, Stephen Street, and maybe Francis Terrace as well. Before that, the jail was a primitive dungeon under the old courthouse, with no ventilation, where inmates were often chained to the wall. Other early works of his included Kilkenny Theatre on the Parade, houses on Garden Row and Gouty Lane, as well as number 4 William Street, which was the Diocesan Hall, the Methodist Diocesan Hall, Riverview House, now Lavittstown House, where the Goodwillies live, and Norland's House. William married Catherine Jones, his first cousin, from Clonmel on St. Patrick's Day in 1805, but they had no children. They lived on the High Street beside Collier's Lane, where I showed you earlier, where the Ormond cleaners were up to recently. And he lived for a short while at Orcherton, which he built around 1804, and in William Street, where he had his offices, and finally at Rose Hill from 1830. Now here I just want to mention his relative, James George Robertson, to whom we owe a lot for information on William. He came to Kilkenny from Scotland aged 12 to work with his architect relation. They were in fact first cousins once removed. So William's cousin, he was the son of William's cousin. He became a respected architect and antiquarian in his own right. He helped establish the first museum in Kilkenny. I think that was on William Street, and was its curator for a while. There's a brass plate to his memory in St. Mary's Church, now the Medieval Mile Museum. He married Juliet Strangeways of Sutton's Rath, and they lived at Prior's Orchard on John's Quay, where his office was located. And later, the family home was on Patrick Street at number 19, where the Blue Bar is now. These are some of his identifiable works. Now, there are much more, but we can identify certain. I already spoke about these early works. He also did Tinney Park House, plans for a bridge in Cappoquin, Lismeth Kew and Tipperary. He did an appraisal and repairs on St. Candace's Cathedral, the House of Industry or Correction on Kells Road, Shankill Castle, Orcherton, which we've mentioned, the Merino Woolen Mills, Animal's House, more repairs on the courthouse, the lovely church in Ennishnag on the King's River, called Church of St. Peter, a bridge in Callan. He did repairs and widening of the Braga Bridge on the old Kilkenny to Cork Road, the Kilkenny Lunatic Asylum, also on the Kells Road, beside the House of Correction, Gracefield Lodge in Laois, St. John's Church. He designed the Cork Female Prison. He erected the Statue of Justice on the Waterford Courthouse, did some alterations and additions to the theatre on the Parade 13 years after he had built it, Evans Asylum, now the home to the Butler Gallery, Kilkenny Castle, Lees Lane Asylum, Jenkinstown House, Kilrush House, Kilmurray House. St. Mary's Church, he erected the tower and other work. He retained the transcript and nave from the old church and part of the chancel as well. He also relocated the road monument. You can see it now. He moved it from the churchyard over to the wall, which was beside the then poorhouse. The Catholic St. Canice's Parish Church on Dean Street. He did repairs on bridge in Venice Bridge. He erected mills in Mullinahone, which he later leased out. Again, repairs on the courthouse. The Cork City Jail, he designed that. Repairs on the Cathedral St. Canice's. He designed and built, I think, St. Mary's Church in Goran, Paulstown's Castle, 3 churches in the county, and here his big work, which went on for 10 years, remodelling this lovely castle. Rosehill House, where he lived from 1830, 3 houses on John's Quay, a school in Dungarvan, the Methodist Church and Manse off William Street, where he lived, Danesford House, which is no longer around, Kilkenny Workhouse and the Carlow Workhouse. They were his last 2 big projects. So here is the St. Canice's Parish Church on Dean Street, the jail, St. John's Church, Rosehill House, where he lived, another view of it, the doorcase to his number 12 in William Street, where he had his offices and lived, and Evans's Asylum, which is Butler Gallery now, twin doors of the building on John's Quay, and the entrance to Orchardton House. He built Jenkinstown House for George Bryan, which was completed around 1820, but fell into disrepair in the last century and has recently been partly restored. Bryan was a month older than Robertson. He was the Catholic landlord, he was an MP, and the two served together as grand jurors. They were good friends, and Robertson's brother John, the horticulturist, had worked on the gardens there. But they had a falling out over some additional payment for work carried out, and Robertson sued Bryan, but lost the case. You don't win against the gentry. They later appear to have resolved their differences and worked together, carrying out future civic duties. Now, this is the original design for the House of Correction, or House of Industry as it was known. And it survives, and it's been tastefully converted into apartments here. Edward Law took that photograph in the 1990s, I think, and this is how it looks currently. Beside that, on the Kells Road, was what they called the Kilkenny Lunatic Asylum. Now, this was an innovative facility for the mentally ill, and he took great care in it, you know. He had underfloor heating even, with pipes, heated pipes going underneath, so that the patients were very well looked after. It was taken down when the offices for Teagasc were erected, and all that remains is the keeper's house. The keeper's house was high up, a good view of all the area. So if you go in off the Kells Road into where Mr. Price is, for cheap prices, you'll see what remains. Now, that's about 2018, that's just a couple of months ago. So it's this structure and the Cashel House, neither of them are on the list of protected structures, which is strange, but they both survived, and hopefully they will. Robertson had a distinctive style, and as all architects do, some functional and some quite ornamental. His townhouses show a Georgian or slightly more fancy Regency style, like Rose Hill, and his larger country houses are mostly neo-Gothic, like the castle here. His favourite practical adornment was dripstones to deflect rainwater, and these can be seen throughout the city, Cashel House and other locations. His trademarks included windows with cut stone, stills and the same rendered hood mouldings such as on Shankill Castle and Rose Hill. We can see his characteristic stone plaques with matching hood mouldings such as on St Mary's Church and on the building beside Mary's Lane in Kieran Street, which Paddy Neary tells me was an old school. In his work here in the castle, he retained the early 18th century classical gateway and added Adam-esque ornaments to it. A first floor castellated oriel window can be seen, which design he copied on the northern facade of his residence at Rose Hill. He was fond of the quatrefoil form of Gothic tracery, which patterns can be seen in stone on the north front of the castle, in his designs of Jenkinstown on St John's Church, and in the glass on the front window of St Canice's Parish Church in Dean Street. This church with twin spires has a castellated portico over which the main window shows plate tracery consisting of 4 quatrefoils, above which are 3 doves, the symbol of the Holy Spirit. It's probable that he also did the castellated lodge on the Canal Walk built by Dr. Robert Gain, because it bears this Robertson's characteristic style and may have been one of his final designs. The Gothic Revival style closely matches on a much smaller scale that of the castle. So here's something of his distinctive styles. The hood mouldings, strips, the plaque, that's Rose Hill, St Mary's Church, and on the side of the Kieran Street building. The quatrefoil on St John's Church and here in the castle. We even see his hand in the 16th century Roth House, so it's likely he did carry out repairs and renovation on Roth House. This is the oriel windows here in the castle, and which he copied for his residence in Rose Hill. There can be little doubt that he was strongly influenced in his work by the medieval architecture of St Canice's Cathedral with its castellated edifice and quatrefoil tracery, which featured he used in many of his larger country houses. He must also have been impressed with the other Gothic structures he saw around Kilkenny, such as the ruined priories of St John and the Black Abbey, as well as the 13th century St Mary's Church, where he was baptized. According to Lenigan and Tyler, their work on architecture in Kilkenny, he represents the earliest school of medieval revivalist of the 19th century tradition. He lived through the reign of 4 monarchs, during which various architectural styles became popular. His time in England as a young architect must also have made an impression on him, with the fine London buildings and the townhouses, as well as the stately mansions in the countryside, some of which he visited. It's unlikely that he travelled across to France, the home of Gothic architecture, during his stay in England, because the 2 countries were at war. In fact, he was there during 1798 when General Humbert and the rest of the French tried to invade Ireland, unsuccessfully. He may also have been influenced by the Clearborn amateur architect who worked in County Kilkenny on buildings such as Bessborough, Castlemoors and Woodstock. He designed, as we know, churches in the county, Inishnag, Ballytobin and Wood's Gift. In Goran, he restored the 13th century abbey, replacing the original chancel with a parish church, which opened in 1826. He was not, however, always successful in persuading prospective clients with his plans. An example was in 1813, when a committee was formed to restore Douche Abbey after it was returned to the Catholic community. He had offered to restore it fully for £5,000, or donate his plans, but this was not acted on. So he didn't come cheap. That was a lot of money in those days. Further afield in Cork, he designed a female prison and the city jail. He bought land there, advertised it suitable to build houses. Near to home in Tipperary, he designed Lismore Kew and Graceful Lodge in Laois, based on the original designs of John Nash, the prominent English architect. Which brings us to his magnum opus, this fantastic castle. His fascination with the castle began when he was a young boy. Writing in 1812, he remembered viewing the castle from the canal walk and seeing some of the vaults open. From his manuscript report, we get a first-hand account of how his work on the castle originated while out walking with Lady Ormond. So he says, in March 1825, on accidentally viewing the castle with the Countess, I observed that the massive buttress which had been applied to the centre of the Den Court front was very considerably protruded from the inclined line of the direction which its summit had. On applying plumb lines to the front wall, I found the summit overhanging about 14 inches, particularly adjoining the buttress, diminishing as you receded to the right and left of it. The interior also, he says, exhibited marked proof of the arrangement. He goes on to say, Lord Ormond's friend, having suggested to him on getting the opinions of another architect beside him, Mr. Semple of Dublin was called in by his lordship, and after examining his examination, he not only fully concurred in my opinions, but went considerably further. Shortly after this, I was directed to take measures to watch the state of the building and to report if I should observe any further tendency of dilapidation. The fissures were immediately filled by my orders and wooden wedges inserted loosely in several of the open joints, so that if there should be any further increase of these, the wedges would fall out. In the course of about a month, it was apparent to the eye that the progress of dilapidation was proceeding, and in another month it appeared to increase so much that on representation of these circumstances, order were given to take down the roof, walls, and the rest of the centre of the building. So thus started his reparation and modification of the castle, inside and out. It was reconstructed on a U-shaped plan, incorporating fabric from the ancient castle. The modernisation, which included introducing water closets and laying sewers, while retaining earlier elements that led to the Gothic style structure that we see today. As Robertson's survey had found, the construction work carried out on the castle in earlier times had been quite poor, requiring its almost total rebuilding. His one initial construction flaw was the flat roof on the picture gallery, which leaked and had to be replaced with an arched roof of Gothic design. A decade previous to him beginning his work, the English travel writer Anne Plumtree remarked that there is nothing of magnificence in the interior and that the building then seemed unfinished without a foundation visible. Now that more or less vindicates what Robertson was saying about the whole building. It was unstable. But as regards, it's interesting that she should say there was nothing of magnificence in the interior. There certainly is lots of magnificence now. So before he started his work, he had drawings done of the castle, and this is how it looks today. His innovation and attention to detail is illustrated in how he replaced the original gutters and downpipes by having the original leaden ones copied, cast in moulds by his plumber John Gray. Today, some of the cast iron heads with the same arm and crest are subscribed H. McGee Fessett, meaning he did it, indicating that they were replaced by this plumber in 1877. This plumber is Henry James McGee of John Street and later Patrick Street. He moved to Cork and died there, age 84. The other So you can see it inscribed there, 1877, and the original ones which Robertson refashioned 50 years before. So what building materials were used? As in his time and before, the two main sources were the black quarry on the southeast, to the southeast of the city, and the beds of limestone lying to the northwest of the city. The limestone, which as we know when polished is called Kilkenny marble, was used extensively for road paving, walls, bridges and general building work. The unpolished limestone arches in these entrances to larger houses such as Orchardton, Jenkinston and Shankill. He used solid sandstone flags over an arched roof of stone from the court to cover the new county jail building, completed in 1807. He used slate, was used for roofing, cladding, flooring, flagging, as well as chimney pieces, eaves and on the facade of buildings. This came largely from the Ormond slate quarries worked by the Highland family. Between 1823 and 1838, he ordered slate from there for at least 30 of his projects, including in 18 for his own house at Rose Hill. Around the same time, while restoring the castle, he took some stone and rubble from here for his house at Rose Hill. Frank Kavanagh, who's an authority on all things to do with the castle, gave me that little snippet of information. Richard Hyland, who's here tonight, gives details on the family's involvement in the trade of the Ormond quarries in the forthcoming issue of Old Kilkenny Review, which should be out in early December. For stone ornamentation, he sometimes used products from the Codestone factory in London, such as for his house in Orchardton. In May 1817, he paid £77 and 2 shillings for a statue of Justice on the Waterford Courthouse, which had been signed and erected by James Gandon. And for the Kilkenny Courthouse, similarly, he paid £63 for a statue of Justice, which was taken down sometime after 1861. The plinth can still be seen on the top of the building. He employed many tradesmen in Kilkenny for his buildings, masons, plumbers, carpenters, as well as general labourers. And he was awarded the contracts for building the workhouse in both Kilkenny and Carlow to the plans drawn up by the architects of the Poor Law Commission. He received criticism in both places. He was accused of using Kilkenny masons instead of employing local men in Carlow, while in Kilkenny he was criticised for delays in completing the building. There were discussions in Kilkenny on whether he had left some parts of the building unfinished, and following an inspection by the Poor Law architects, the commission stopped him £10 out of his account. It was successfully and satisfactorily completed in 1843. Remnants of that workhouse are preserved in what is now McDonagh Junction shopping centre, and the site of the Carlow houses, the Carlow workhouse, is now part of the Southeast Technological University campus. These workhouses were sorely needed shortly afterwards when the Great Famine hit in 1845. So the greatest monument to Robertson's memory is his redesigned Kilkenny Castle, the central attraction around which the city's tourism is now based. The building was described more than a century and a half ago in the following glowing terms. This remarkable castle was originally built by Richard de Clare, Earl of Pembroke, better known in this country as Earl Strongo. It was subsequently rebuilt by his son-in-law, William Marshall, who made it his residence. It was again, for the greater part, rebuilt by the second Duke of Ormond, and then consisted of 2 sides of a quadrangle containing 3 of the round towers of the ancient castle. It was several years since partly rebuilt by the late Marquess after design of Mr. Robertson of Kilkenny, and retains the ancient towers with the style and character of which additional buildings harmonise. He goes on to say it would be difficult to furnish an adequate description of this grand castle. Indeed, with the exception of Her Majesty's Palace, Windsor Castle, I've not seen any building of the kind to equal it. Now, the Thomas Lacey was a little bit prone to hyperbole, and he rarely criticised stuff, but we'll take it. Not everyone, however, would agree with this glowing assessment. The late Jeremy Williams, a native of Offaly, like myself, he was an architect and architectural historian, described Robertson as the Kilkenny-based architect, remembered today for his drastic restoration of Kilkenny Castle. He rebuilt Gorn Castle in a chilly neoclassicism for the second Viscount Clifton. Here he recorded 17th century house, but ruthlessly demolished it. He did have drawings done of it. The same ruthlessness is also evident in his rebuilding of Kilkenny Castle from 1825 onwards. Williams also said of him, what a dry stick he is as the architect of Grecian or Gothic country houses. I don't think we'd agree with that. Now, he liked to put himself forward as a conservationist and a pioneer preservationist of architecture and in building restoration. He was anxious to portray himself as a conservationist, and as early as 1808 he lamented the devastating hand of man on his native Kilkenny and how he was attempting to preserve those traces of the past then fast disappearing. He talks about the woodlands fast disappearing in Dunmore, in Troyes Wood, in Temple Amala, as he calls it, and which gave such celebrity to this elegant little city. And he goes on to say then that Kilkenny sails down the stream of time unheeded and unattended, and posterity will probably deny that she ever possessed these features, mementos of which I now attempt to preserve. So, with many of his own buildings now destroyed or much altered, he might again decry the hand of man, the destructive hand of man. Nonetheless, he was a pragmatic man, and as he did in his own time, he'd also see the necessity for modernizing some buildings. As well as making his own drawings, he employed three artists to record these features of Kilkenny's past for posterity. This was really for his book as well, which was never published in his time. George Holmes was the first. He was a Dublin man, Dublin artist, who he married a Kilkenny woman while here and published a book in 1801. And he went on a journey. It contains drawings of a tour and text of a tour now, which began and ended in Kilkenny during August and September 1797. There were two English-born artists, George Miller and Richard Gibbs. Now, for some reason, the Knight of Glyn and Cruikshank called Richard Robert Gibbs. He always signed himself just R. Gibbs, but he was in fact Richard Gibbs. And he married a daughter of the celebrated Cork artist Nathaniel Grogan. Unfortunately, she died in having given birth to their child. George Miller was a tragic character. He married a Waterford woman, and when they relocated back to England, his wife died and his daughter, and he afterwards took his own life in Hyde Park under very salacious circumstances, which I won't go into now. Miller's work, part of the Miller Robertson collection, is now in the Royal Society of Antiquaries in their archive, and it comprises one volume of his finished watercolours and 7 sketchbooks containing preparatory drawings and notes with some other material. This unique album collection was donated to the Kilkenny Archaeological Society and came into the possession of its successor, the RSAI, in 1890. Conlett Manning published details of the collection with a representative selection of some of the most interesting watercolours and other images. These are a couple of preparatory drawings done by George Miller. They're in the National Library. This is an old mill in Kilkenny and Canis as well. So in 1816, Robertson had intended to publish a book on topography. The first volume was to be on Kilkenny. And he advertised for subscribers and exhibited specimens of the plates in Dublin. He also published a promotional booklet, proposal for publishing by subscription the Itinerarium Hibernicum. The booklet was published in 1816 in London. The promotional booklet contained 23 aquatint engravings, a couple from in the city and some from the county. Whether due to lack of subscription support or for other reasons, the full book was never published. His protege and relation, James George Robertson, maintained that his numerous professional engagements ultimately prevented him from carrying out this intention. A year after his death, James George selected 34 of the original aquatint plates, which he incorporated into a book that was published in Kilkenny in 1851. In 1983, the Kilkenny Archaeological Society had a facsimile limited edition made of the book with some additions and a splendid introduction by Margaret Phelan. Now, that's one of the engravings that was to be in the book. It's in the National Library of Ireland. This shows the merino factory that I mentioned earlier that Robertson's brother-in-law was involved in. It was a terrific invitation where young boys and girls were trained about weaving and got a general education. But the bottom fell out of that industry and it faded, and Timothy Nolan absconded. For all of his work, he had drawings done of historic buildings before he carried out any restoration work, including how this castle looked and St. John's Abbey, which he wants to record for posterity. He was not adverse to reusing stone from older buildings and other structures. For example, he reused medieval grave slabs in the building of Evans's home, which is now the Butler Gallery, in 1819, and this is described by Anne Carolina Distel in the forthcoming issue of Old Kilkenny Review. He apparently incorporated these into the building from the earlier infantry barracks on the site, which had used the material from the Priory. Some 10 years earlier, in around 1809, he had helped to extend his brother's nursery business back from the High Street shop after clearing the area between Collier's Lane and Walkinsgate, knocking part of the city wall in the process to create the appropriately named Garden Row. The clearing of the walls opened up this area where William built houses and then erected more on William Street, as well as off Flood Street on what was known as Gouty Lane, adjacent to what is now Friary Street. I never knew, I was intrigued about the name Gouty Lane, never knew where it was. So Paddy Neary, who knows all things about streets of Kilkenny, showed it to me last week. As well as being a very successful and busy architect, he took an active part in the civic and community affairs of the city for more than 40 years. Both he, his brother, as well as their future brother-in-law, Timothy Nolan, were members of the volunteer force called the Kilkenny Legion in 1804 during the Napoleonic Wars. Such volunteer forces were formed from the citizens on occasions of foreign war or apprehension of danger to the state. He was elected an alderman in 1829. He was elected mayor in 1831, taking up the post in September of that year. He was the first city man and outsider from the gentry to hold the mayoral post. And this was generally lauded in the local newspaper, particularly the nationalist one, the Kilkenny Journal. In the final days of his mayoralty, cholera hit Kilkenny with 88 cases and 53 deaths recorded by 28th of August. It was particularly severe in the Butts, Blackmill and Irishtown parts of the city. When it was first reported in the country, he had convened a meeting of the citizens to consider the steps they should take to prevent the introduction or lighten the fatality of this disease, should it appear among us, which it definitely did. He was a jurist and on the grand jury for 20 years. In 1833, as former mayor, he was foreman of the grand jury. The grand jury was the forerunner of the modern county council, made up of members selected by the High Sheriff from the leading landowners in the county, with the primary role of raising monies for a variety of local public works. He was one of the four justices of the peace who investigated the fire here in the castle office in January 1839, but they were unable to determine the cause and concluded that no blame could attach to anyone connected with the office. He was labelled a Tory by some of the nationalist newspapers, but was in fact really a liberal in politics. He backed the Catholic emancipation in the 1820s and the Repeal Association in the 1840s. He participated in the repeal demonstration of August 1843, when thousands marched from the city to Cuffs Grange, where he was the final speaker to address the crowd, after which the multitude then quietly dispersed, which was said in a local newspaper. So he had a calming influence. He employed many people in Kilkenny, craftsmen, masons, plumbers, carpenters. He was also a mentor to young architects, including his own relative John James George Robertson, and many others, in fact. He was a very wealthy man. The amount of properties he had here and in the county was incredible. Besides these two residences, he owned properties in William Street, John's Quay, Barrack Lane, Chapel Lane, Wellington Square, and also his brother and his sister owned many houses as well. By the end of his life, his name is associated with almost 80 Kilkenny properties, either as the landlord or tenant in the Griffiths valuation. So, his death and legacy: he retired as an architect at the end of 1845 and died at his home, Rosehill, on the 23rd of May 1850 in his 80th year. He was buried in St. Mary's graveyard beside the church where he had been baptised, across the road from where he worked in William Street, and near to where he was born on the High Street. Both local newspapers of the 25th of May carried short death notices. The Kilkenny Journal noted that he was an extensive and a good employer, while the moderator called him architect, an accomplished artist and liberal employer, adding that as regards Kilkenny, it may be truly said, si queris momentum circumspes. That allusion to him being the Christopher Wren of Kilkenny, whose epitaph was a variant of that, and which means if you seek his monument, just look around you. And it's indeed an apt to Robertson, whose work, although then much more prominent, can still be seen throughout the city and county today. After his death, his wife Catherine, with the help of James George, carried on the running of his business, including a farm up at Rosehill. She died in January 1872, aged 86, in her home at Rosehill, and was buried in St. Mary's churchyard alongside William. So, at long last, his work has been appreciated. The work of Robertson has finally been acknowledged by the decision of the Civic authorities to name a thoroughfare in his honour. The new road linking the Callan and Ballycallan roads as part of the Western Environment Project is named William Robertson Way. So that's just to sum up the milestones in his life. and we've covered that adequately. If you're interested in any further reading, article in Old Kilkenny Review, and a very nice booklet that the late Michael O'Dwyer did, and it's lavishly illustrated with some of the illustrations from the RSAI Miller Robertson collection. Now, just a word about tomorrow. Paddy Neary will, as Fonzie said, lead a walk showcasing some of William Robertson's buildings. So if you want to see them in the flesh, as Fonzie said, congregate at around 10:45 and leave at the horse trough, and we leave at 11. Thank you very much.